Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Let's look at the front lines and find just how bad Russians are doing, and we're going to discuss why exactly this is happening. So, first things first, I want to acknowledge that Russians have been moving a lot along the border with the Sumy region, and right now they are trying to exert some control along the border. We're gonna come back to it, but this is very interesting. Around Vovchansk, I told you many times that this is where Russians are attacking, they're taking something, then Ukrainians are counterattacking and retaking something. Right now, we are in a swing where Ukrainians supposedly retook this settlement of Vilcha. But again, I'm not pointing too much attention towards it just because it is a push and pull. Situation around Kupiansk is stable. Russians are trying still to get into Kupiansk despite their best attempts. Situation around Liman. Here we had some Russian approaches towards the city of Liman, specifically from this direction, whereas Ukrainians actually are trying to undercut those efforts and they are attacking towards Yampil, trying to, you can see, like, slice off this salient that Russians are using to attack Liman from the eastern side. Overall, this is not going that well for Russians. It is way too slow. In more than like 3-4 months, they barely advanced anywhere. Situation around Siversk direction, I explained many times that here we're following like a natural border that Russians need to cross in order to start threatening their main strategic objective claimed of Sloviansk Kramatorsk. And the specific thing that we were looking for is how fast they can close the pocket which is to the east of that line. And that is not going really well for Russians, because while they are seemingly advancing towards the west slowly, we also heard about successful Ukrainian counterattacks in the village of Kalenki and Zakitne. So any consideration that this direction can become really threatening for Ukrainians is still not there. We see Ukrainians are resisting even in the pocket that Russians are supposed to just kind of close down. Around Konstantinivka, we heard about Ukrainian counterattacks in certain directions. They helped a little bit tactically, but generally speaking, right now, Russia is exerting pressure on 3 directions around Konstantinivka, and they are slowly advancing through the city. But again, the tempo is not what Russians really want if they want to reach towards Kramatorsk, Sloviansk this year, because Konstantinivka is just the first town on the many that they need to get through on the way there, because they still need to get through Oleksiivka, Drushkivka, and through Drushkivka, and those are kind of comparable. So yeah, this is not going really well for Russians. Around Dobropilya axis, where Russians had this salient, Ukrainians were able to cut that salient off completely since last year, and now the situation is stabilized, and this is especially notable around Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk-Mirnograd. Here I want you all to note one very specific things. While there are fighting right now around Grishine, and Russians are pushing and having some success moving towards the west, what did not happen is what a lot of propagandists were claiming, stating that Ukrainians are able to defend this area only because of Pokrovsk-Mirnograd, whereas I was telling that it doesn't matter. Pokrovsk-Mirnograd would just be 2 big urban settlements that will cost Russians a lot of casualties, and they did, but even taking these towns will not really allow Russia to increase the tempo of their forward momentum. And well, now we're again seeing that it was us who were right on this channel and not the propagandists claiming that Russia is about to break through as soon as they're past Pokrovsk and Mirnograd. And finally, around the southern direction, Ukrainians here have been mostly stopped. We do hear sometimes about some Ukrainian counteroffensive actions. Novogrigorivka was never really confirmed to be in control by Ukrainians. So I say that we got in a 50-50 situation. Ukrainians improved their position. They have the fire control along the road that Russians are using to get towards the front line. But also Ukraine didn't really achieve the major success that we were hoping for, that would be reaching this kind of cluster of towns. and so Russians are still having the ability to push westward. However, that push is undermined, obviously, as nothing is going easy, and right now the biggest fights are happening somewhere here around Mirne, which is kind of like this coming point between the eastern moving Russian, west moving Russian offensive and north moving Russian offensive. But I think the real story is actually told by the numbers. We were looking at April very intensely, specifically looking whether Russia will increase their tempo of advances after pretty terrible February and March for them, where it was doubts even if Russians have the power to restart their offensive that was ongoing the whole 2025. And so far, even April is not really going that well for Russians. Last week it was, the week before it was 1 kilometer per day. Now it's 5 square kilometer. These are not the tempos of the Russian offensive. These are tempos of the still awful March and February of Russia. So Russia still cannot really gain any momentum of restarting their offensive campaign. And here I want to stop and talk about why Russia is now obviously failing in Ukraine, and 2026 is critically the year where we're going to start seeing the changes really happening on the front line. Now, Russia has been having a lot of issues. Their army and strategy has been very flawed from the beginning. But for a very long time, both me on this channel and a lot of other pro-Ukrainian YouTubers that were trying to explain it get a hard time for doing so, because Russia was still advancing on the front line, and while the map is being colored red, a lot of people were dismissing those narratives. But there were fundamental issues in what Russia was doing. The difference between the Russian and Ukrainian military, the directions that they went. The Ukrainian military that took a defensive position, tried to focus on solving their internal issues, trying to prevent them becoming a small Soviet army and find the key to this war. And Russian military that tried to just leverage the amount of resources that they had access to and essentially crush the Ukrainian will to live. And it was the competition of these two approaches, and I think that it's now becoming obvious that Russia was not the victor there. And this is becoming so obvious that even the questions that I'm getting about the war in Ukraine are now not the same ones that I was getting in 2025. In 2025, I would be constantly asked whether Ukraine can hold against this Russian onslaught. In 2026, I am now getting questions non-stop about when will Ukraine start taking back the territory from the Russians. It's a massive change even in this feeling, like a gut feeling perspective for a lot of people. They smell the changes in the air. Something is up. And I believe this something is up can be boiled down to 3 big factors. 1, Russian personnel and equipment losses. 2, Ukrainian developments in military technology, working on their mistakes and focusing on efficient scaling. 3, Russian lack of strategy and lack of vision for military victory in Ukraine. So let's start with the Russian casualties. And I think the graphs here and numbers are speaking for themselves. Now, some people obviously ask me and stating that at the end of 2024, Russians had much bigger losses, and there are 2 explanations for this. One was that this was the time when Russians were at the peak of their power, where Russians were rolling out infinite number of equipment, and they were still not fully adapted to the new Ukrainian drone warfare, and they were just throwing manpower to solve any issues. They're still doing it, but now it changed a little bit, because there is the second connection here, which is that at that time, there was no real control on the losses. A lot of time, losses were calculated. For example, if an FPV drone strikes an armored vehicle, sometimes the estimates were just like, okay, if the vehicle was full of people, let's say half of the people got injured, and another half of those injured maybe are gravely injured, and maybe some of them are even dead. That is how the losses were estimated right now. After that time, Ukraine has implemented changes that required visual identification of losses. So not only the strikes on specific Russian soldiers and vehicles became requirement to get the confirmation of these numbers, secondly, a lot of the casualties are actually not even recorded because sometimes Ukrainians are striking Russians when they are not having the second drone film this whole thing. So those are very common in Ukrainian military as well. But deadliness is very much obvious for Russians. If we're taking into account 2025, 2026 at the end of the year, we see December 2025, 35,000 casualties, January 31,680, then February 26,300, March 31,700, and right now it is April 16th, and by the 16th of April, there is already 17,400 Russian casualties. And the death to wounded ratio has also been growing exponentially, and now it is completely obscene because of the current realities at the front line. Majority of these Russians are now dead. And Ukrainian side is aiming this year to achieve the 50,000 Russian casualties per month, and I'm pretty sure they will be able to do so. But we all know that Russian losses is just half of the equation. Second part of the equation is, well, how much Russia is able to reinforce their military. And if the previous chart was made by Ragnar Bjatur, thank you so much, my friend, for continuing doing this job, then the second analysis was done by Janis Kluge, the German analyst. And he here looked at the data that there is about the recruitment for the Russian military. Because a lot of Russian tactics are based on the fact that the resources are infinite, that whenever there are need for new manpower, that manpower will just arrive. And Janis Kluge took a look at the numbers, and numbers are not good for the Russians. Firstly, let's look at the data here. So if we try to look at the data that has been there for 2024, then generally speaking, in 2024, you can even see this growing trend that generally speaking, as the time went by, the effectiveness of recruitment for Russians have been going up. That they were, through the whole 2024, increasing the number of their forces. But what you note right away in 2025, that seems to be not the case. You can see that like, oh, we're going here up, we're going here down, we're going here up again, and so on. We see that some trend going upwards is still there, but the amplitude and variation is much higher. It's becoming harder for Russians to get those numbers that they want in. And those numbers were not always really beating the numbers from 2024. And then by the 2026, we see that it's a massive drop. It's one of the lowest recruitment numbers from all of the previous years. And so far, it is not very encouraging for Russia, because he underscores that Russian regional budget suggests that Russia recruited 70,500 soldiers during the first quarter of the year. 70,500 is just over 23,000 per month of Russian soldiers that are being recruited. Even here, you already see the issue. If Ukraine is able, by this point already, to get Russian casualties to 30,000 per month casualties, and Russia is able to recruit only 27,000, then already here we have minus 7,000 difference for the Russian military. And data is not also showing that things are going well for recruitments. The recruitments across the Russian regions have been dropping, and more importantly, the Russian regions are now once again trying to increase the sign-on bonus that was seemingly maxed out at the last year. And it was maxed out because Russian budgets were just running dry. Russian economy in regions were awful. But now, the start of the new year, Russian regions got a little bit boost in their funds at the start of the year. So now they're trying to kind of pull the numbers back up, that they're able to send some more guys to the front line. And unfortunately, it is not going well for Russians, that even with the increase in the sign-on bonuses, they are not getting the numbers that they were getting before. But even more importantly, the quality of these troops is now diminishing significantly. Have a look at this one.
Покажите, пожалуйста, свои руки. Хорошо.
Я Хасанов Анвар Атамаевич.
Громче, пожалуйста.
Я Хасанов Анвар Атамаевич призвался пунктом отбора Сириус.
Покажите, пожалуйста, руки.
Александр Владимирович.
These guys are the fresh Russian military recruits that will go and fight on the front lines. And Russian Z propagandists are stating that this is not just some one case, that this is right now the people that are being signed on the Russian military, and it's a massive problem. But more than that, Russia has also a dreadful situation with regards to the vehicles and armor. Now, if you don't know, there is this analyst Jumpy, fantastic guy. All of these years, they've been looking at satellite images and thoroughly counting every single vehicle that is stored on these Russian storage bases. And fantastic job. But now even he is acknowledging that there is not that much sense to look at the Russian storage bases anymore because Russia pretty much emptied them out. That whatever they're having there is just going to be used for refurbishment or some metal pieces. That by this point, it is pretty much obvious that Russia doesn't really have any more stored reserves, and whatever they're producing, that is the thing that's going to be going to the front line for the Russian operations. All of the Soviet reserves, the second superpower in the world, that it was accumulating for over 50 years to fight the first world superpower and all of Europe, all of these storage facilities gone in 4 years of war in Ukraine. But let's move to the point number 2. One of the stated Russian objectives in Ukraine was to demilitarize Ukraine, to make sure that Ukraine will not pose a threat for Russia. And before you start eating me alive, this is a Ukrainian threat. Here they're laughing at the Russian pitiful attempts early in the war to try to ridicule Zelensky and Ukrainian aviation. Well, now it's 2026 and we're getting Zelensky with these guys. Because with this, the equation that we are talking about with the Russian personnel in minus personnel out is becoming a lot more problematic. Because what Ukraine did over the last 4 years is work on their mistakes. They were investing. They were investing in weapons. They were investing in technologies. Russia really aimed at brute strength, that they're just bigger. They just can go forward and crush Ukraine because Ukraine has nothing, that they can just ridicule Ukraine. But Ukraine, they hold on and they worked on their mistakes. Ukrainian military understood that they cannot use the soldiers the same way Russians are doing. So it was critical to start working on technologies, to develop these technologies. And solutions like Brave One, like a common community platform where all of the different weapons manufacturers are coming in together, putting their heads together with the Western technologies and Western money to try to create this new type of warfare, more efficient warfare, making one unit of manpower on Ukrainian side being much more deadly than one unit of manpower on the Russian side. So while Russia is now struggling to recruit personnel, period, it is also less efficient than Ukrainian personnel because of the way Russian tactics works, because Russians are just trying to focus on just sending their troops towards Ukrainian position and just overwhelm the Ukrainian forces, whereas Ukrainians are investing. And specific change was in 2025 when we saw more and more pioneered by the Danes, the Danish model so-called, where the Western power, instead of just producing weapons for Ukraine, they started working with Ukraine, working with solutions like Brave One to try to focus on delivering material to be produced in Ukraine with a cheaper component costs, with cheaper labor costs, essentially getting more efficiency from every single dollar of investment toward defense of Ukraine. And now the most dreadful news that Russia could get is not only that with defeat of Orban in Hungary, the 90 billion loan is now going to be released for Ukraine, but after the recent Ramstein meeting, NATO countries have stated that this year they will provide 60 billions in military aid to Ukraine. And supposedly a lot of this will be besides what is going to be provided by the loan of the 90 billions. This means for the next 2 years, Ukrainian government and Ukrainian defense are funded. There is going to be money to crush the Russians. But not only that, the efficiency of Ukrainians have increased. At first, it was the efficiency of the workforce. When Ukraine introduced these all electronic tables, when they removed a lot of the Soviet-style journaling, where you needed to write in the actual paper journals every single drone that you've been using. And now it is all done electronically in one unified system. Now we see Ukraine getting the drone teams that are performing well to have more points that they score, such a gamification of this warfare, which they can use the points to buy more equipment from the sources that are showing to be, again, better for the cause. Ukraine is streamlining innovation. It is creating all of these systemic functions that allow streamlining of innovation, and efficient working solutions get streamlined to the front line compared to the Russian model, where yes, they can produce a lot of some big things, but it's usually done through inefficient means, where some oligarch has like a company that think that they can copy one of the Ukrainian designs and they can just scale and mass produce it. And while it allows them to keep up with the general kind of technological advances on the front line, the edge is always on Ukrainian side. But even scaling on the Russian side right now is being questioned by Ukraine. Because if at the start of war, Ukraine just had a lot of mom and dad shops that were producing FPV drones, now we have big companies that grown out of these mom and dad sweatshops, and they're working with the Western militaries to get more and more technological advances on the front line, not only introduced, but also scaled up. Ukraine has built massive underground factories, diversified distribution networks that are resistant to the Russian bombing campaigns because they don't store big facilities at one single location. They are all prepared for this. By this moment, Ukraine is stating that they can produce over 8 million FPV drones per year. I still remember the time when it was only dreamed of that they could get some drones on the front line. And since recently, things have gotten really, really bad for Russians with the innovation coming into Ukraine. The new drone that is completely wreaking havoc beyond the Ukrainian front lines is so-called Martian. It's a drone that already has sophisticated software technology that is able to fly through the electronic warfare. The images that you're seeing, why this is important, this city that is right now on your screens, this is actually Donetsk. Ukrainian drones are flying through Donetsk. Here, this is the place where this was filmed. And Ukrainian drones are flying through this city looking for targets inside of the backlines of the Russian position, trying to find where there are soldiers thinking that they're safe, where they are driving their vehicles with supplies that they need for the front line so they can get their activities on the front line started and attacks on Ukrainian positions. Now they're being hunted in depth. Russia is now going to be struggling a lot getting the supplies even through some of the further areas such as Donetsk. So now that we understand what is happening on the front line, I think it's important to tackle the most crucial point, the fact that Russia has no strategy. Remember this? Remember the dream scenarios that Russia was painting at the start of the war, that already Odessa was about to be captured, Dnieper, it was already there, Kharkiv was already like in the middle of the Russian control, Kyiv was already encircled many times and only some Ukrainian forces just got left to be completely taken care of. This was the 24th of March 2022. And this was the Russian dream scenario. This is their whole battle plan that they had for this war. We go in, we try to crush it, and that's it. And when it didn't work, it really didn't improve since then. Because let's think about it this way, right? Russia is telling us that their main goal this campaign is to capture Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, that the big fortress cities in Ukraine. We talked about them so much. But when we start talking about Russia is advancing, right? When we start talking about the kilometers per day that Russia is advancing, we find out that the advances that Russia is having are very rarely in those directions that are moving towards that main goal. When you actually look at how much Russia is gaining in these, then it's gonna get like in very low numbers. It's gonna get like maybe 1 or so kilometers per day, because main Russian approaches are actually recorded somewhere in the south. Or right now, in the last weeks, where Russia got this 5 kilometer per day, is because they were attacking in the Sumy region. Why? This goes thoroughly against any kind of doctrine that would make sense. Because the doctrine that states that like you need to make your forces more efficient, you need to concentrate your force on the target. And the answer is very simple. Because Russians have not changed their perspective. They still think that they just can win this by just overwhelming Ukraine. Their whole calculation was basically in 2025 that Ukraine is gonna break. Because they said, Russia big, Russia strong, we have a lot of manpower, more resource than Ukraine, therefore we can attack more places than Ukraine can defend. We have more vehicles, so while we can spare our vehicles, we're just gonna overwhelm and crush Ukraine. They didn't. They didn't crush Ukraine. And while some kilometers were gained, Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, it took them a year and a half, but they finally did it. The truth of the matter is, they are not gaining the necessary positions that they want to for any kind of military victory. They are not advancing even to their stated goals. They are kind of moving here and there, but they are not really getting the job done that they want. Strategically, they're not concentrating their forces. More than that, the fact of the matter is that in Russian military, you are getting penalized if you are not advancing. Losing manpower is bad, but you know, it is what it is. But not advancing, not gaining victory is actually terrible. Because if you don't advance, then you get penalized. Then you get people coming breathing down your neck to get your job, to try to butter up to the higher ups so they can get better positions and better corruption schemes. But so this motivates the Russian generals that work on these different directions to be selfish, to dedicate more manpower just so they can color a lot of more of the map. And so they can report to the higher-ups that, hey, I don't know what's happening on other direction, but on my direction, we're doing great. You know, we're attacking, we're capturing settlements, and then they report this to Putin that then states that Russia is non-stop advancing and it is being propagated by the Russian campaign. Whereas in reality, again, it goes completely against the Russian doctrine. And I still remember all of these videos of the infinite lines of the Russian vehicles that were there up and ready to go against Ukraine, that went in to crush Ukraine. But all of these three factors combined made that these videos that showed these non-stop from horizon to horizon Russian columns that were on all directions in Ukraine. This was not just one street, every single directions that Russians entered Ukraine, this was what we saw. 2026 is a nightmare for Russians. They will be crying crocodile tears about how bad this year will be. But the good news is that this is only the worst year so far, and it's gonna get much, much worse. Trust in Ukraine, support Ukrainian armed forces. I love you. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.